Come on, Ukraine, bend over and take it. Now I get it, cooler heads always prevail, and you want to choose your battles wisely, especially if it might involve World War III and mutually assured destruction by nuclear annihilation, which is precisely why we cannot continue to allow murderously malignant, power-hungry psychopaths such as Vladimir Putin and his inner circle of equally or greater malignant psycho/sociopaths to continue murdering their opposition, their journalists, their political dissidents, and sending their young men to die in wars for their own gain, but not necessarily for the Russian people as a whole. But more importantly, we can't allow them to continue to hold all of humanity hostage with the specter of nuclear war as they gain more and more power until it affects how the rest of us have to live. Especially when it comes to making more alliances with other murderous tyrants such as Bashar al-Assad from Syria, who has also done whatever necessary to remain in power while massacring the Syrian people and creating mass migration problems from the Middle East. The understandable, though somewhat short-sighted argument that the invasion of Ukraine is mostly NATO's and the West's fault seems to be the current cliched argument by many people that do not want a war. And at the very least, these people are consistent in their logic. But to say that it is mostly, if not all, of NATO and the West's fault that Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine is dangerously misguided. And it is an equally false equivalence to state that this is precisely what the United States would have done with Mexico had Mexico installed defense bases on their border. While the government corruption and ineptitude of both Mexico and Ukraine are comparable, the governments of the United States and Russia are absolutely not. Here in the United States, activists, let alone journalists, are not being murdered or disappeared by our government. Just look at how much needless havoc was allowed to happen during 2020 after the death of George Floyd and the demonstrably false narrative of unarmed black Americans being systematically killed by racist police officers, or that white supremacy was still the biggest threat to our democracy. The fact that hundreds of riots were allowed to occur in dozens of cities, where more people were killed as a direct result of the riots, which was close to about 30, in comparison to the number of unarmed black Americans killed by police in the previous year, which was about 19. The fact that all that needless, avoidable chaos happened proves that our citizens are hardly under the threat of a white supremacist government out to kill anyone who isn't white and or Anglo, let alone Christian and specifically Protestant. Contrast that to the amount of Russians that are forced to flee their nation if they have any disagreements with how Vladimir Putin has changed the Russian constitution to allow him to basically be president of Russia for life and to virtually rule by decree, as he's doing now by ordering men of military age to go and fight a war that he's not risking his life for, even though that war is specifically about keeping him in power. The amount of journalists that have been killed, almost to the point of being made an example, the amount of political opponents and dissidents, including former chess grand champion Garry Kasparov, who had to basically flee for his life for having the audacity to run against Putin for president. These are the reasons why we cannot let this murderous psychopath continue to hold the world hostage. And none of that is happening here in the United States. Quite the opposite. None of the very people who have profited in the millions from the established grievance industry have had to flee for their lives. Not the founders of Black Lives Matter, who arguably misappropriated millions of dollars in donations and bought themselves private mansions. Not career politicians such as Jerry Nadler, who downplayed the threat of Antifa and how that domestic terror threat has ruined entire cities such as Portland, Oregon, basically rendering them unlivable. None of those people have seen a day in court for their responsibility regarding all the destruction of businesses and livelihoods throughout numerous American cities in 2020 and beyond. Guess how they would have been treated in Russia? That should pretty much answer that false equivalence that people continue making when they try to compare the United States to Russia, and how this is playing out because of NATO and the West. Granted, socioeconomic, geopolitical issues are much more complicated than finding clear-cut villains and heroes, but some of the villains, such as Vladimir Putin, aren't that difficult to identify. especially considering the amount of damage he's done to his own nation, his own people, beginning with the Russian apartment bombings of 1999, killing more than 300 people, injuring thousands, and then blaming that on Chechen separatists and triggering the Second Chechen War in order to make himself look like an indispensable, irreplaceable leader. The United States' foreign policy is hardly innocent, simply dating back to our involvement in the Vietnam War as well as the invasion of Iraq over the claim of weapons of mass destruction and the 20 years and trillions of dollars spent in Afghanistan. There's a lot our government has to answer for. However, in the end, we stepped away and allowed those nations to govern themselves. If the United States is guilty of anything, it's the war profiteering that has enriched and empowered people like former Vice President Dick Cheney through companies such as Halliburton. But we're not silencing our own journalists and political opponents through murder for calling that out. We're not murderously expanding our borders into Mexico and Canada in order to ensure more profits for an oil monopoly in this nation, much like Putin's stranglehold over the oil industry in Russia. And that's precisely why Putin invaded Ukraine. It's hardly imperialistic ambitions, much less about Mother Russia's sovereignty. It's all about not having to pay the Ukrainian government any more money than necessary to carry Russian oil through pipelines across Ukraine. For all the corruption that Ukraine's government can be found guilty of, for any of Volodymyr Zelensky's faults such as silencing pro-Russian media outlets during this time of war, Ukraine is hardly at fault for being invaded under Putin's orders, and let alone for any denazification purposes. Zelensky is Jewish after all, and Putin's claim that Russia needed to invade and reclaim territories in Ukraine is a shameless power grab that has cost the lives of thousands of Ukrainians as well as Russians. From all the academics like John Mearsheimer to all the pundits weighing in on the issue, who are essentially telling Ukraine, just stay down, just bend over and take it. Don't be surprised the day you're told to do the same. Freedom isn't free, and most people don't appreciate it until it's too late. It's a shame that sometimes peace can't be achieved without war, but that's thanks to the Vladimir Putins of the world, not the West, not NATO, and not the Volodymyr Zelenskys of the world who have every right to a free and independent nation that they will clearly fight for to the bitter end. Of course, no one in their right mind wants a nuclear World War III, which is why we need to stop the Putins of the world that continue to hold the rest of us hostage with such threats for their own selfish gain. If I got anything wrong in this video, which I'm bound to, I've just been shooting my mouth off, please let me know in the comments down below. But if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for upcoming videos, and check out the links below for my original art and merchandise, and thanks for watching.